Welcome to Conversations with Father Bosco, a webinar series hosted by the Office of Mission and Ministry and the Georgetown University Alumni Association. Thank you for taking time out of your day to join us for this session, Environmental Justice and Laudato Si with Father Gaël Giraud. Our host, Father Mark Bosco, is Vice President for Mission and Ministry at Georgetown University and holds an appointment in the Department of English. A native of St. Louis, Missouri, Father Bosco joined Georgetown in 2017 after 14 years at Loyola University Chicago, where he was a tenured faculty member and served as director of the Hank Center for the Catholic Intellectual Heritage. As a scholar, Father Bosco has focused much of his work on the intersection of theology and art, specifically the British and American Catholic literary tradition. He has published on a number of authors, including the writers Greene and Flannery O'Connor, and is the co-director and co-producer of the feature-length documentary on Flannery O'Connor. This award-winning film will have its television premiere on PBS American Masters on March 23rd. I'm Kelly Young, Associate Director of Strategic Engagement in Alumni Relations, and I'll be facilitating today's webinar. As a quick reminder, today's session is being recorded and the recording will be shared via our follow-up email. You may also use the questions section of your webinar control panel to submit questions for Father Bosco and Father Giraud. Without any further ado, I'm pleased to turn things over to Father Mark Bosco.
Well, thank you, Kelly, and thanks for that plug for the Flannery O'Connor documentary on March 23rd. I appreciate that. That's great. And it's really a pleasure to be back here with these conversations. Today we have a brand new Jesuit to Georgetown. We're so excited. He's just arrived, coming out of quarantine. Actually, I think today. So this is a kind of a nice celebration. Father Gaël Giraud, who's a member of the French province, and we are just so deeply grateful to have you with us, Gaël. So welcome to Georgetown.
Thank you, Mark.
Gaël and I met about 4 or 5 years back. I think the first time actually in France, in Paris, and then we met again, certainly in Bilbao again, when we were part of the International Jesuit Conference on Higher Education, where you did a stunning work on environmental sustainability and really the kind of very much a prophetic talk. So I just want to do a little bit of background with you, Gaël, since you're brand new to Georgetown, things like that. We know that you're going to be in this McCourt School of Public Policy, that's going to be your home. But first, tell us a little bit about what brought you to Georgetown as director of our new environmental justice program. You know, you're a Jesuit from Europe. Can you tell us a little bit about your vocation story, just how you got here?
Oh, before my vocation story, how I got to Georgetown. Actually, Georgetown came to me and told me that there was a generous donor from California who had said, well, I'm willing to bring some money in order to create a Center for Environmental Justice here in Georgetown, but I want to be able to choose the director. But apparently when she saw my CV or whatever, she said, well, this is my guy. I don't know this donor. So, and then Bob Groves, the provost of the university, told me, well, are you ready to join us? And I said, yes, why not? But then, of course, we had to go through the Jesuit authorities, and these came back to the Father General in Rome, who decided to send me to Georgetown.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. I know that we wanted to get you here a couple of months ago, but between COVID, quarantining, and just visa problems, it took a little longer to getting you here, but technically you've been really with us since the fall semester. Yeah. Why did you want to become a Jesuit? What was it about, you are, come on, I'm just going to be really honest, Gaël, you're an intellectual giant, very humble about it all, but you're this amazing kind of agent in the world in terms of economics and in terms of environmental sustainability. Just tell us, why Jesuits? What drew you to the Jesuits?
So maybe I should tell a few stories regarding, which took place a couple of years ago. The first step is certainly when I was 19 years old, actually, I spent my holidays in my family in Switzerland because I was born in Paris, in France, but my mother came from Switzerland, and therefore I speak Swiss German, for instance, which is a beautiful dialect, as you know. And then at this time, the unique person in my family who could welcome me was a priest and actually a prof in theology, who was at the same time the chaplain of the Swiss military army, the Swiss army, Alpine army. So he was a mountains guy and at the same time a prof in theology. So he brought me to work on the glaciers, 5,000 meters high. And then over there we discussed theology. And then I discovered an entire world. I was just 19 years old, you know. I discovered Karl Rahner, I discovered Hans Urs von Balthasar, all these giants of the Catholic theology of the 20th century. And when we came back from all this, he told me, now you should read serious things. And he gave me two books, one book by Rahner, the other by Balthasar. And then I started reading them. And then I discovered, you know, let's say Jesuit theology. Then he told me, you should learn how to pray. Then I went to a Jesuit, a French Jesuit, and I said, well, I need someone to follow me, you know, an advisor, a spiritual advisor. And then I started the exercises, etc., etc. So this was the first step. And the second step was during my civil service. Instead of doing a military service in France, I did a civil service in Chad, in the south of Chad, which is southern from Libya. I was teaching math and physics in a Jesuit high school. And during my free time, I spent a lot of time with street children. And I launched actually a center for street children. This was like 20 years ago. So I spent a lot of time with these children in the street. I slept in the street with them in order to become a friend of them, and so that they would become my friends, etc., etc. And I have made a beautiful experience with these children. That is, to a certain extent, I would say, they have evangelized me for the second time in my life. I rediscovered, you know, what happy be the poor might mean, but concretely, it was a kind of experiential experience with these three children. And then, for instance, when I came back, first I asked to enter into the Society of Jesus, saying, well, I want to have to live this kind of experience during my entire life. This is my place. And second, so my father died at this time, exactly at the very time where I asked to enter. And the novice master told me, you have to wait a little bit because you have to take care of your family. Your father just passed away. You are the oldest in your family, etc. So I waited, and then a private bank came to me and asked me whether I would be ready to work for this bank to do some mathematics, since I had a PhD in mathematics, applied mathematics. So I said, well, why not? Because I needed some money after you know, the death of my father. And so I worked as a scientific consultant for banks, waiting for the time I could enter into the society. And then after a while, this bank offered me a job as a trader in New York, in Manhattan, Wall Street, you know. And well, I said no. And the main reason why I said no, I was 30 years old at this time, 29 years old. I said no because I thought, when I will die and when I will meet my street children in heaven, you know, what can I tell them if I spend my entire life, you know, working on financial markets in Wall Street? This doesn't make sense. I want to be able to share again the joy I have experienced in Chad with my street children. And this cannot take place in Wall Street. So then I said no to the guy who offered me the job. I came back to Paris, and eventually I could enter into the society. So this is how this happened.
Wow, that's great. Well, now I didn't know about Chad. I knew a little bit about your life just from our own conversations and friendship, but I didn't know about how pivotal that moment in Chad was for you. That's great.
Definitely.
Yeah, and part of Jesuit training, that was before your Jesuit training, wasn't it?
Yeah. It
wow.
was before.
Yeah. So you see your vocation very much charted there. That's fantastic. You know, you do a lot of work with math, economics. You had a job really, even as a Jesuit, in your own professional journey as a Jesuit, working as an economist for the French nation, as well as doing ongoing research. What did you do for France in the role that you had, and what kind of intellectual life did you have as a Jesuit, say even 10 years ago?
Well, actually, for France and for the French government, I did three things. The most basic one was that I served as a researcher in mathematical economics, doing some math applied to economics. And then very quickly after 2008 and the big financial crash, I took a number of positions trying to understand and to help understand how we could regulate finance so in such a way that such a big crash would not happen again. For instance, I wrote a report for the European Parliament about the cost of not regulating financial markets in Europe, and what this will cost in case we would have a new crash similar to the one we had in 2008. And so this was the second aspect of the work I did. And the third one, I served during 5 years as a chief economist of the French Development Bank, which is a public bank, non-profit, quite similar to USAID in the US. So it's the French analog of USAID. And over there, I served as a chief economist. It's probably the first time in history that a Jesuit became chief economist. Maybe the last time, I don't know. And so at the beginning, it was a little bit surprising for many of my colleagues. So they were observing whether I would try to, take an opportunity of giving a speech at the IMF or the World Bank or the United Nations as a chief economist, whether I would try to take this opportunity to evangelize people, to speak about the gospel, but I did not, because I had to be respectful of the so-called French laicity, which is very important for French people. And then after a while, I got the confidence of my colleagues, and we could work in a very, very fruitful way. This was another way to evangelize without speaking about the gospel. But you can evangelize even though you don't mention explicitly the gospel.
Right.
So yeah.
I would imagine that Catholic social thought could kind of permeate your whole, your whole life
definitely.
As an economist. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So I have put a lot of emphasis on the issue of justice, environmental justice already at this time, and especially on the so-called commons, the common goods, Yeah. So probably under my influence, I guess, the French Development Bank has developed a lot of projects linked to the commons, especially regarding the management of water, for instance. The main experience that we had is that if you try to privatize water in poor countries, or you ask the state to take care of water, this usually is a disaster. But if you ask a small community, especially the women, to take care of the water as a common good, then this is success. And the best example for that is that in La Paz, Bolivia, which is one of the two capitals of Bolivia, in 2016, during the summer, the people in La Paz made the terrible experience of the day zero, that is the day where you don't have water anymore on tap. At the same time, the poor in the suburbs of La Paz, who had organized themselves in such a way that they would manage water as a commons, they still had water. So the bourgeois in the center of the city didn't have water and they were starving, whereas the poorest outside the city, they still had water at the same time, you see. So it is a very impressive example.
Right, wow, that's impressive. That's the communal responsibility
exactly.
for common goods, yeah.
Yeah.
One of the things, Gaël, that we had to wait for you in some ways. We could have, we've looked at you at Georgetown for quite a while, but one of the reasons we had to wait for you is because you were doing a second doctorate. Yes, folks, a second doctorate in theology. And I love the fact that you mentioned Karl Rahner and von Balthasar as a kind of early inspirations. They're two great, European theologians, I think, and of course von Balthasar had been a Jesuit as well. But so first of all, congratulations on the doctorate in theology. Can you just tell us a bit, number one, why did you feel like you wanted to go for a second doctorate? And what was your thesis about? Why was it important to have the second degree?
Well, maybe the first part of the answer is that I like theology. So, this might be a reason. And the second reason why, because my provincial asked me to do this PhD. So, as a Jesuit, I have to obey.
Very
obedience.
Obedience. Okay.
Sure. So I did it under the supervision of Father Christoph Theobald, who is a German Jesuit, but living in France. So it was very interesting because Theobald is a great theologian, and he has the systematic way Germans think, grundsätzlich we would say in German. Yeah. And at the same time, he lives in France, in Paris, since 30 years. So he knows also the finesse, the French finesse, So it was very, very beautiful to work with him under his supervision. The topic was, so to say, the political theology of the Anthropocene. That is, I started actually before the publication of Laudato Si, but to a certain extent, it's the political theology of Laudato Si. So what does it mean to say that as a Christian, we need to have a specific relationships to the creation, that we have to take care of the creation? What does it mean in terms of political theology? Obviously, this changes a lot the paradigm that we have in mind if we follow, let's say, liberation theology in the sense of Latin America, or even la teología del pueblo, the theology of people, by Scanone in Argentina, as you know, of which Pope Francis is certainly one member. So my initial thought was that this changes a lot about this paradigm, and we have to rethink it from scratch. So let's do it. So this was the beginning of this PhD in theology.
So yes, you were working on that even before Pope Francis's great encyclical Laudato Si. Huh. And so just kind of piggybacking on that, Laudato Si comes out, right? It's a phenomenal work. I mean, we at Georgetown have been talking about it. Matter of fact, we at Georgetown have just added one of our Spirit of Georgetown values, care for our common home, to be one of those values that we inculcate all of our students and to all of our staff and faculty, that this is one of the values in which we try to strive and work. So you saw a lot of things resonating in Laudato Si. Does it continue to shape your views? What, if you had to say, what was the most important thing in Laudato Si that just needs to be said over and over again and really digested by Christian people?
Maybe I would say the article number 123 in Laudato Si. So I guess everybody is going to see.
I'm going to write that down.
Exactly. There, the Pope says there is the same underlying logic, underlying the neglect for ecology, and the idea that we don't have to take care because the invisible hand of the market is doing everything, which is not true, because there are many failures, market failures. So the Pope says that it's the same logic behind this neglect on the one hand, and crime against children on the other hand, or crimes against elderly people. So this is very shocking when you read it for the first time. This sentence is very strong. So it says it's as if, you know, people neglecting ecology would be as criminal as sexual criminals against children.
Yeah.
And when I met the Pope last September, the 3rd of September in Rome. I had an audience with him, and he came back to this, and actually he added a third dimension, which is how do you say this in English? Machism. I mean, the fact that you would neglect, as a man, you would neglect women and not pay attention to the rights of women.
Right.
So it's the same logic behind neglecting the creation and ecology, neglecting children, women. So I would say that's probably the most interesting aspect of the whole encyclical, which is to say we have to take care of this logic which is behind our behavior, even unconsciously, in order to help God actually evangelize this aspect of our nature.
Yeah, there's a wonderful sense that if we can recover our relationship to nature, to our environment in a respectful way, it will that if we can recover that, we will also recover the way in which men and women work with each other, the way in which we take care of children, the way we take care of the elderly. That if we treat the creation as if it's a commodity, or it's just something to be used, or something to be abused for that matter, then we're going to be using and abusing one another. So he really wants to raise that up to the same level. And as an encyclical, it's, you know, there's many great encyclicals, but it bears rereading over and over again, because it really is prophetic. It's really asking something of the world. And I love the fact that he's writing this for everybody, right? This is not just for Catholics or even for Christians. He said for people of all goodwill, right? To come together and to do this. Yeah.
Exactly. So we could say to a certain extent, what he's denouncing, and you have the same in chapter 1 of Fratelli Tutti, the last encyclical, it's the commodification of the world. That is, if you treat creation and nature as a commodity, as you said, you will sooner or later treat also children as commodities and your woman as a commodity, etc., etc. So this is, so to say, a new understanding of sin, actually. I mean, commodification is a sin. This is essentially what he is saying.
Right. And so he's asking for, with all of its encyclicals, he's asking for a new vision, a new way to see the world, to see relationships and creation. And that means you have to drop some of the assumptions of the way you see now, and he really wants to kind of deconstruct some of the ways that we think is normal or normative ways of thinking to allow us this really one based on the vision of Christ, right? A kind of a care, yeah. It's an amazing encyclical. We have a lot of students who are very much engaged in that on campus here, as well as alumni now working in areas around sustainability, it's been fantastic. I think one of the things another Jesuit once said to me that you also know, Mike Garanzini, he once said he thinks that in the environment is the one issue that philosophers, economics professors, theologians, business people, everybody can get around, especially the 18 to 22-year-old student, because it's their world. They're inheriting a world that's pretty well broken by a kind of this is industrialization for the last 300 years. And so no matter what angle you come at it, you really do sense that this is our project. Our project is to make sure there's a world for our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. Yeah.
Exactly.
So tell me a little bit, Gaël, about what you particularly do as a mathematician, economist, and a theologian, of how you do these two things together in what you're going to be doing at Georgetown. So we bring you to Georgetown. We want these two aspects of your life to come together. You work with data, as I understand.
Yeah.
What makes data so important and such a prophetic part of your job?
Well, on the aspect of economics itself, I would say there is a big challenge today, which is to better understand the impact of climate change and the erosion of biodiversity on capital, on GDP, unemployment, etc. Just to give you one figure, William Nordhaus, who got a Nobel Award a couple of years ago, keeps repeating since 30 years that according to his models, a global warming of plus 6 degrees Celsius at the end of this century will just induce a loss of the world GDP of minus 10%. Minus 10% of the GDP. This is 10%. What we are going to 10%. Yes, 10%. Sorry, yeah. This is what we are going to experience this year, 2020, because of the pandemic. So that's nothing. So plus 6 degrees, you can imagine that's the apocalypse on Earth. So the problem is that if you keep repeating that, and if in addition to that you get the Nobel Award, then the whole profession of economists will keep repeating that. And at the end of the day, at the IMF, at the World Bank, at the United Nations, people will believe, global warming is not such a big deal, just minus 10%, and so if you think of it, you have to go back to the model that is used by Nordhaus, whose nickname is DICE, and you have to understand that this model is probably entirely wrong. So if this model is entirely wrong, we have to rebuild another model, another paradigm. And actually, there are some people who said this already by 2016. Probably you're not aware of that, but there was a big earthquake within the profession of economists in summer 2016. You had at the same time someone like Paul Romer, who at this time was the chief economist of the World Bank, and who meanwhile also got the Nobel Award, who wrote a paper saying that standard macroeconomics went backward in the last 3 decades. Second, at the same time, you had also Olivier Blanchard, who is a French economist, but teaching at Harvard, and who at this time served as the chief economist of the IMF. He also published a paper saying our models are basically flawed. Mm. So this was a kind of earthquake. So a number of economists realized that actually the best among us were saying, guys, we are entirely wrong. We have to rethink entirely the type of models we're using. So to a certain extent, if the first part of my job is to do this. It might look ambitious, but I do believe that we have to do this. I'm working together with people like Joe Stiglitz, because he's aware of that and he's pushing in the same direction, and a number of other economists. So this is one aspect. The link with theology is the following. I'm convinced that at a certain level, what we need to think and to promote is, as I said, the commons. That is a new way to share resources, because there are a number of resources that are going to be scarce in the coming decades. Let me just mention copper. I published a paper with a friend of mine who is a geophysicist in France about copper. And it turns out that copper is going to become a critical mineral in the coming decades if we don't pay attention, especially if we don't recycle it systematically. So if we want to take care of all this, probably we have to develop the commons. That is a way to put resources in common and to take care of them collectively, which of course has nothing to do with communism. But this requires a new imagination in terms of institution, that we have to create.
Right.
Let me just give you an example, a concrete example regarding health, because this is becoming a big problem, courtesy of the pandemic. And it turns out that 15 years ago, there was a very interesting, fascinating, actually, institution that was created in Geneva, Switzerland, actually, I think by French doctors, which is called DNDI, Drugs for Neglected Disease Initiative, DNDI. DNDI is dedicated to producing therapies against diseases which are neglected by the private sector, because those people who are suffering from this disease obviously are too poor to be interesting in terms of business. But what DNDI does is to put together around the table sovereign states, big pharma, that is the private sector, and NGOs from the civil society. They work together and they succeed, for instance, in providing the therapy against the hepatitis C in Egypt for $300 instead of 3,000 euros in Europe.
Wow.
So that's a big success. So this means it's possible today to conceive health as a common, where it's not just the state which takes care of that, it's not just a private sector, but you need a kind of hybrid institution, So we need a new creativity, a new institutional creativity in order to take care of the commons. And this is where Christianity enters the picture, I believe. Why? Because for this creativity to be operational, we need resources, we need spiritual resources. And my experience is that Christianity can be one of these resources, not a unique one. I'm not saying that Buddhists or Muslims have nothing to say on this, but we Christians, we have a lot of experience and traditions to bring to the world in terms of commoning. If you think of the Acts of the Apostles, this is exactly the description of the first church. They were putting everything in common. That's written 3 times actually by Luke. So this means something in our spiritual tradition. So that's, to a certain extent, this was the main message of my PhD in theology, saying we have a treasury of spiritual resources, we as Christians, and we can talk to the world, to all the people of goodwill, and provide this spiritual experience in order to bring, resources to for people who need to invent new institutions.
What happens also is that there's a sense that it is a spiritual journey of conversion, to see a bigger world, to see creation as something that we nourish and we protect, as well as then saying that it means protecting and nourishing the people around in the world. So it really does it's a conversion of heart and mind to care for our common home. We hear, Gaël, especially over the last, since Pope Francis especially, but even before that, these phrases, and I'm sure some of our alumni and students here too, human integral development. And what to you, how would you summarize that? And what's the way that you think economics play in shaping that?
Well, there is dicastery today in Rome, whose title is Dicastery for Integral Human Development. My own interpretation of that is that what Pope Francis is doing with this, he's changing the type of anthropology that we have in mind. Saying, and that's exactly what he says in Laudato Si and in Fratelli Tutti, saying we need a relational anthropology. We as human beings, we are relationships. I'm not an atom living on its own, like Leibniz would say, for instance. I'm just a center of a number of relationships. I'm just a node in a network of relationships with you, with a number of people, with creation, with animals, etc., and also with my past and with the future, etc. So if you think this way, I believe we have to re-understand completely even economics. Because if you think of the Homo economicus, which is the standard human being according to conventional economic theory, the Homo economicus is not a relational guy. He's completely alone in the world. He's in a metaphysical solitude, just eating, consuming, watching prices, and making rational decisions. But that's not a human being. What Pope Francis is saying is that a human being essentially is someone who enters into relationships with the others. So this would be the way I would understand integral human development. That is a development that fosters this relational capability of people, among others, and with creation.
That's great. That's great. You also hear it more and more. We a couple of years ago we had a speaker here at Georgetown, Nancy Tuckman, who talked about integral ecology as a kind of parallel collaborative thing. What do you understand? What do we mean when we say integral ecology then?
Well, it's a little bit different. I don't know exactly what this means in the US, but in France, in Europe, let's say Western Europe, integral ecology has a much more ambiguous meaning, in the sense that it's an occasion for a number of people to say, well, we have to take care of ecology, but we also have to be, let's say, pro-life. So it's an occasion for some people to bring together ecology activism and pro-life activism. So I'm not sure that this is the political direction in which the dicastery for integral human development is striving. So that's why I would say it's much more ambiguous, at least in Europe. I don't know about the US actually.
Yeah, integral ecology, as I understood it, at least at this talk at Georgetown, was much more about the way how you understand what you create and what you spend is then brought back into a kind of sustainability. So that integral ecology, at least again, Dr. Tuckman was saying, was really about a kind of how do we sustain growth by not just continually discarding, kind of that, how do we not have a throwaway culture of things and energy, and how do we make sure that we have almost a cycle of rejuvenation, a cycle of it. But that's an interesting, I didn't know that about the European phrase, phraseology. So you come to Georgetown, you're going to be doing what? You're going to be doing lots of, I know you're already very well known at the World Bank from your time working for the French nation and stuff. So I'm sure you're going to be connected that way. But as somebody here who's in the McCourt School of Public Policy, what do you see the things you have to get going here? What, I guess in a phrase, what do you hope to accomplish in these first years at Georgetown?
Well, in the first year, I don't know, to be honest, but the perspective I have in mind, the broad perspective is the following. There are at least three things I would be very happy to be able to put into practice. On the one hand, some interdisciplinary research at the crossroad between macroeconomics, renewed macroeconomics, and climate science, physics, biology, etc. Because this is a place where many economists, unfortunately, don't really speak to scientists. So currently you have a big debate inside the IPCC. Group 1 within the IPCC is the group of physicists. Group 2 is dedicated to global warming and its consequences. Group 3, adaptation, mitigation, etc. So group 3 is the place where you find all the economists. And actually it turns out that group 3 is not talking to group 1. And when people from group 1 are looking at what people from group 3 are doing, they are just astonished. They say, well, I mean, one of them told me, you guys, economists, you are comfortable with models that are violating the first two laws of thermodynamics every day, and you can sleep with it. I said, well, you're right. So my first plan is to try to help these two communities of scientists talk together, group 3 and group 1, physicists and economists. And I think this is very important for environmental justice, because as long as we don't understand, I mean, deeply the impact of climate change and how and what we can do against it, then we will just be out of the picture. I mean, everything we will say will be irrelevant, it seems to me. The second aspect will be a portfolio of projects. So it's much more applied, but to a certain extent, it's what I did already when I served as the chief economist of the French Development Bank. What I did at this time, I went to a number of governments from southern countries, and I told to the head of state or the prime minister, look, we both of us know that you are facing huge challenges linked to climate change and and the destruction of biodiversity, etc. But we also know that nobody is helping you. Why? Because the IMF has no clue about what you do. And the World Bank, on the other hand, has a fantastic research department where I know a number of my colleagues are working. But the operations department is quite distinct from the research department. And people from the operations, they are just repeating the same recipe as ever, namely flexibilization of the labor market, opening of the frontiers, etc., etc. So they can't help you on the ecological front. And then I said, so my small research team at the French Development Bank is ready to help you. What kind of advice do you need? And to my own surprise, I had a big success. So let me just give you an example. I was received in Vietnam, Hanoi, as a minister with the diplomatic protocol of a minister, because the government of Vietnam is just in a situation of panic today. Why? Because they have realized that the Mekong Delta in the south of Vietnam is going to be underwater before 2050 because of the rise of the sea level.
2050.
50.
Wow.
2050, yeah. And the Mekong Delta is the place where they cultivate rice for the entire country. So, so there is a question of food security and the macroeconomic trajectory of Vietnam without the Mekong Delta. So when I came, they just welcomed me as a, the Messiah, saying, "Can you help us?" So we tried to do many things with the small team I had at the French Development Bank. But my proposal today would be to say, let's do the same job, but with Georgetown, because this would provide a lot of case studies for a number of students, which could help provide ideas, solutions for a number of countries, which are just, alone. So I already received three proposals, even though the center is just
wow,
born.
that's great.
Yeah. So the first proposal was from the Mauritius government. Mauritius, a small island in the Indian Ocean near Madagascar. So they told me, look, we have everything: the rise of the sea level, erosion of biodiversity, heat, humidity, lack of drinkable water, typhoons, everything. So what is the macroeconomic trajectory of Mauritius in the next 25 years? That's as simple as that. So I hope I will find students in Georgetown who are eager to help Mauritius. So that's the first project. The second one is I met with the ambassador of Mongolia in Geneva in the United Nations last year, and he told me that the government of Mongolia wants to create a network of organic farms. Why? Because the nomadic population in Mongolia is starving because of global warming. So these nomadic people who actually live, kind of in the middle age, they just settle down in the suburbs of Ulaanbaatar, but they are slumified and they get very, very poor. So the idea of the government is to say, we are going to launch a network of organic farms where these people can settle down. But of course, he has no clue about what you do in order to launch a set network of organic farms. So again, I hope that I will find students and researchers at Georgetown who will be able to help this government find a solution for that. And the third project is actually a French project, which is very amazing. It's linked with Mayotte. Mayotte is a very small island, very poor, again in the Indian Ocean, close to Mauritius, actually. But I don't know whether you're aware of that, but 1.5 years ago, a big volcano emerged below the surface of the sea, 50 kilometers away from Mayotte, and led to the second biggest eruption that was ever recorded in history, the biggest one being in the 18th century. So this is an incredible phenomenon. Maybe you're not aware of that because
I'm not even aware of it.
Yeah, just a few people know that. So today the volcano is 800 meters high below the surface. And since this is just 50 kilometers away from Mayotte, everything goes as if the volcano had pulled, the soil with it, so that the general altitude of Mayotte shrunk by 17 centimeters within 1 year. So they have lost 17 centimeters within 1 year. So they are just frightened because they know when the next typhoon comes, they will be just overwhelmed.
Yeah.
So the French physicist, warned the French government, saying we do have a big problem with Mayotte because of this volcano. The French authorities, public authorities, took this very seriously because they created 2 jobs of civil servants who are asked to observe the phenomenon. But of course, they can't do anything. So this is just useless. So people are still frightened. And the physicist came to me and said, well, can you help us understand the economic cost of doing nothing and possibly find an alternative, a strategy in order to improve the resilience of Mayotte for the next big typhoon that is going to just destroy Mayotte. So these are very concrete examples where environmental justice can be put into practice, you see.
Wow.
So this is the second, I'm sorry, my answer is a little bit long, but this is the second aspect of what I plan to do here. And the third, which might be also very interesting, is the following. I have visited a number of beautiful ecological campuses, that is university campuses, where we try to fill the gap between what we say and what we live. Because, you know, the young generation, the young students are telling us, well, Prof, you gave us a beautiful lecture about ecology, and now you're taking the plane. How come?
Yeah. Right.
Doesn't make sense. So this kind of schizophrenia, we have to overcome it. And to give you just an example, there is a beautiful place in South Africa where I used to teach. I used to teach before the pandemic, which is the Sustainability Institute in Stellenbosch University, a beautiful place where the university campus itself is located within an eco-village. So all the water is recycled, wastes are recycled, all the electricity comes from solar PV on the roofs of the buildings. Everybody is gardening, everybody is vegetarian. So before teaching in the classroom, you spend half an hour, 3/4 gardening with your students outside, doing some permaculture, and then you enter the classroom. And I can tell you that the atmosphere, the pedagogical atmosphere between, let's say, the prof and the students is completely different. It's just unique. So my idea is that Georgetown could become an ecological campus. Why not? And above all, could become a platform where the network of ecological campuses in the world could share, you know, experiences, best practices. Why not even students, profs, etc., etc. So my goal is to create a worldwide observatory of ecological campuses in Georgetown.
Yeah, you know, just hearing what you're saying, Gaël, and just your host for these, which is just superb. A couple of things just come to my mind, and our students are at that kind of that pivot place of the School of Foreign Service, the McCourt School of Public Policy, the School of the McDonough School of Business, the college. I mean, healthcare. Our new school, college, our school for healthcare. There is a sense that, you know, it's the thing that threads us through all together is this environmental challenge, right?
Yeah.
And so I think you're going to find a lot of students who are going to be very interested, whether it's in policy, whether it's in how they work in government. But there is I think there's a real hunger for depth in that. And I'm glad you're here to allow Georgetown's students to really go deep and to take those tools into the world. The other thing that that kind of hit me was the fact that Georgetown has for the longest time has really tried to be a world-class university and tried to engage the environmental question, right, in terms of sustainability. And I have to say, in my 4 years here, I've watched it even grow and more and more. So I think you're going to have a lot of partners here. I'm sure you've already met many of those who are not only trying to turn the campus into an environmentally sustainable place, but you probably met those who are really kind of planning for the future. What will we look like in 10 years, 20 years as a sustainable place? It's an important place, which kind of brings me to my next question, because one of the reasons why Georgetown was excited to have you is because we kind of think of Georgetown as situated in our capital city. In many ways, it has an ability in a status in the U.S. to convene so much, not only nationally but internationally, right?
Sure.
And so I'm thinking, you know, how do you see Georgetown serving not only the Hoya student community, but really serving the universal church and the international community. You hinted at some of that, but I just thought maybe any more thoughts on how can Georgetown, situated in such a unique place, really convene and kind of spearhead some of this?
Well, well, I'm sure you know this better than me, but it's clear to me that the kind of influence that we could have on a number of governments in the South is I mean, the best place to start this is Washington D.C. for sure. We can have relationships with the World Bank, obviously, with the IMF, also with WRI, which is a fantastic think tank on resources, and a number of other international organizations, which are all located in Washington D.C. So obviously, that's the best place to do this. I would add to this, you know, that there is a political momentum today thanks to the Biden administration. And probably we also have to provide some insight about the impact of climate change, also for the US, because the US will not be, you know, immunized against the consequences of climate change. And for instance, one of the work I tried to do within the first, you know, part of what I was describing earlier is to couple together a macroeconomic model with a climate model, which provides you with information all over around the world every 50 kilometers. So if we are talking about the Alps in Europe, that's too broad because after 50 kilometers, either you are on the top of the Mont Blanc or you are just in the valley. So, but except for mountains,
Right.
50 kilometers, it's a high spatial resolution. So we could be able to provide a lot of information also for the US, and this might be of interest for the Biden administration. So I do believe there is a huge political momentum today for us, and I would say there is also a big challenge, which is the relationships with China. China has taken the opportunity of the last 4 years of, let's say, the Trump era in order to, let's say, grasp a lot of power in a number of countries, especially in Africa, in order to grab resources, actually, to be honest, and also in Latin America. So we definitely have to rethink something like the international community, the rule of law at the international level. Probably you noticed that the United Nations didn't say anything about the pandemic. So the Security Council was entirely absent from the international debate during the pandemic, even though this is the biggest tragedy at the world level that we had since 1945. So this is a small symptom of the fact that it seems to me the international community has to be rebuilt on new grounds. So, and probably what we are trying to do at Georgetown might help in this direction. Again, this might sound very ambitious, but I do believe that we are in a situation today where we need to be very ambitious in order to have some change to provide, you know, an habitable world for the next generation.
Right. I really do see one of the things about working and being part of Georgetown is that we can also help invite others to network with us because of where we're located. So, and I'm thinking of the Universal Church. Wouldn't it be great to have the different Jesuit assistancies in Africa and Europe on board with the data and with some of the things we're doing, so that we can disseminate, but we also can learn what's going on. You know, the old saying that, you know, the Pope always had the ear of Jesuits around the world to kind of get the other story, right, than from what the bishop might be saying. And I do see in some ways that Jesuit institutions in general, Jesuit higher ed, especially in their research, can still be those kinds of ways of networking information that's more honest and much more clear cut than perhaps might be stated. So I think that's a really cool thing about your coming here. Your background in France and of course in all of Europe, your background in Africa allows us to kind of see, you have a network of already Jesuits and colleagues who are working with Jesuits to kind of create a global kind of conscience around this issue, and allowing Georgetown to, again, to continue to kind of prod, propel, and articulate with others what's going on. So it's really cool in that regard.
Thank you. What I should add to this is, I should have said it earlier, is the fact that I hope also to be able to work with Mike Garanzini, actually, with Father Garanzini, on just what you said, that is, let's say, the promotion of the ecological transition as a concept within the network of Jesuit universities in the world. because, as you know, this is a big challenge, and Georgetown might be, the leader among all the Jesuit universities in the world in this direction, in order to help everybody synergize and coordinate on this big issue, where essentially we have to change, the curricula and also the lifestyle on the campus. Right. So we have to teach to each other and to learn from each other how to do this, be it, let's say, in La Javeriana in Bogota, in Colombia, or in business schools in India, or in Chicago University, Loyola University in Chicago, etc., etc. So this is also a fantastic project.
Very good, very good. Listen, we're going to have to get to some questions from some of our listeners, and so I'm just going to go through these. And the first question to you is as both an economist and a theologian, how do the findings on capitalism in Thomas Piketty's have on your views of solutions to social justice or environmental justice? I remember we talked about you had a kind of a sparring conversation with Piketty at one time, but could you speak about his work in relationship to what you're doing with questions of justice and environment?
Yeah, sure. It turns out that Piketty and myself, we are classmates. So we know each other from the École Normale Supérieure since more than 20 years. I would say the following. For sure, he did a great thing by putting in the forefront the issue of inequality of income, inequality of wealth. Okay. But I would say I don't think that Capital in the 21st Century is a great book, because there are many mistakes, both at the analytical level. The model he's using is just wrong, and the data are not good. So I'm quite critical. So we had a lot of discussions on this. So I belong to the so-called adversaries of Thomas Piketty in France, even though he's considered as a half god in France, But I'm still very critical, and I published it. I published a paper on his book saying, look, there are a number of problems with his theory. His theory is not good. He's wrong, actually. For instance, let me give you a small example. The very famous equation R bigger than J, which is in his book, which is R is, let's say, the outcome, the product of capital, how much you earn every year, let's say, from the capital, and J is the growth rate of the economy. And Piketty claims that if R is bigger than J, then we are going to get troubles. But that's not true. The analysis is wrong. And I'm not the unique one to say this. Let's say, for instance, Hashimoto from MIT also wrote a paper to explain that this is wrong. So I think Piketty is working too rapidly and does not pay attention to what he writes, actually. But this does not mean that the main conclusions are wrong, unfortunately. It's true that at the same time, inequalities have exploded in the world, especially in the US, but not just in the US, and that this is a big problem. And for instance, there is a link between, let's say, environmental justice and social justice, in as much it's actually the richest who are polluting the more and emitting the more CO2. Approximately, to give broad figures, the richest 10% in the world population are responsible for 50% of CO2 emissions. And the bottom 50% of the population are responsible only for 10% of CO2 emissions. So, there is a huge inequality, given the fact that the main victims are the poorest. So there is a link between reducing inequality on the one hand and fighting against climate change on the other hand.
That's great. Yeah. His book was quite a sensation, even here in the United States, as you can imagine. But
sure.
Another question from one of our viewers is this: Father Giraud, how would you address the real problem of developing poorer countries being the ones bearing the brunt of climate change? Well, you kind of mentioned this, when the wealthiest countries, who are also more responsible for man-made climate impacts, are still reluctant to take issue as the first international security threat. So I guess in many ways you spoke to that, but anything else you'd want to add to that? Because it takes there's a lot of political and private interests that hamper the efforts, as this viewer suggests.
Yeah, I would say, it's our responsibility, and it's also in our interest to take care of our own security in terms of climate change, even in the US, but also to take care of the security of the others, of the poorest. Why? Let me just give you an example. There are some beautiful research articles that have been published in Nature 2 years ago about the impact of climate change in terms of heat and humidity. I'm sure that you have made the experience that jogging in the jungle in Vietnam is much harder than in the savannah in Chad. So I did both, so I can witness this. Why? Even though the temperature in Vietnam is obviously much lower, it's 35 degrees Celsius, whereas in Chad you have something like 40, 41 degrees Celsius. But the big difference is humidity. It's much more humid in Vietnam. And it turns out that you have combinations of heat and humidity which are lethal for the human body. Now, these people, these climate scientists, they have checked that if we don't do anything in terms of climate change, and if we still follow the so-called RCP 8.5, which is the most pessimistic scenario of the IPCC, then at the end of this century, the entire basin of the Amazon will be just empty because it will be inhabitable for human beings because of these combinations of heat and humidity. Wow. Same story for the basin in Congo, same story for India, almost the entire country, and same story for Southeast Asia, especially Indonesia. So which means when the World Bank is talking about billions of climate refugees in the second half of this century, this is not an exaggeration. If we don't do our homework in terms of mitigation, we are going to have a huge amount of climate refugees throughout the world, and they won't just die peacefully. So which means big geopolitical problems. So we definitely have to deal with this now in order to prevent much broader and much more complex problems in the near future.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, there's something very prophetic about the work you're doing, an urgency to it all. We have time for one more question, and then I have one last question for you myself. But this is coming from another alum. How much do you think Laudato Si has influenced or preceded the environmental, social, and corporate government, the ESG efforts, gaining force in business and financial environments? Do you think Laudato Si was influential, or just kind of paralleled, or what?
Well, ESG obviously started before the publication of Laudato Si. Laudato Si was published in July 2015. But I would say what Laudato Si has induced is the conscience that we as Christians, we cannot just escape from that and ignore the ecological issue. So today, I would say it's not possible to be a Christian and not to be an ecologist at the same time because of Laudato Si. And I'm sure this was not clear before 2015. So I think this is the big achievement of Laudato Si. Now, in terms of ESG, this obviously has helped a number of Christian managers and leaders in their own efforts towards ESG. But there's still a lot of efforts that have to be done. Let me just give you an example. I had a number of conversations last year with some finance people from Switzerland. These are Catholic people, and they want to launch a fund, asset management fund, that would try to put into practice some, the Catholic social teaching, and at the same time some ESG principles. But when I talked to them, I realized that we still have, to make a lot of efforts and improvements in order to take seriously what Laudato Si was saying or is saying, especially the Article 123 that I was mentioning at the beginning of our discussion.
Wow. So we only have time really for just to close out now, just a minute or so. But we're so grateful that you're now going to be at Georgetown and part of the Jesuit community here, and part of teaching and research for our community. And I know you just came in. You are also somebody who was laid low by the pandemic, by COVID-19. I can share that, I think, and are now getting over it. But if you give a word of hope in the midst of all this, in terms of environmental sustainability, in the midst of a pandemic, what would that word of hope be to our viewers today?
I would say, what brings me hope is the fact that there is no escape road from this pandemic if there is no international coordination among countries. As long as there will remain at least one country, one big country, which will not take care of the virus, where the virus will be able to disseminate and to have genetic mutations, we will have a seasonal pandemic, and the virus will come back to us every season. We will have to create new vaccines every year, etc., etc. So the unique way to escape from this nightmare is to have a real coordination among all the countries. This is in the self-interest of everybody. So actually, to a certain extent, it's an occasion, it's an opportunity, a fantastic opportunity to relaunch and refound the international community on the basis that everybody has understood that health is a global common good, and that, you know, the health of people in Wuhan has an impact on my health and on your health. So we cannot just ignore it.
Right. Yeah, there is a sense that we're at a turning point where we can create what it means to be a citizen of the world, not only for individuals, but as nations,
Exactly.
where we can come together for, we're seeing the common good really on a global way, as opposed to just a particular way in front of us, right in front of our eyes.
Exactly.
That's great. Well, Gaël, thank you so much for being with us. After the pandemic's over and our alumni can come back to campus, I'm sure you're going to be hot on the market for talks at Gaston Hall. You bring such a wealth of information and a passion for this work. This is the right place for you, and so we're just really glad you're here. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Mark.
And everybody here on this, we're continuing the conversation. So please join us at our next one. Continuing to introduce some of the newer Jesuits to faculty and scholars here at Georgetown over the next couple of months. Thanks for being with us. And Mardi Gras today, so hopefully you have a nice Fat Tuesday, as we say, and a very blessed and holy Lent. Bye now.